Hello and welcome to another video review. This is SiN Episodes Emergence for PC. This is a first-person shooter, the sequel to SiN, and the first game in the SiN Episodes episodic content series. It was developed by Ritual Entertainment and first released in May of 2006, although it never got any sequels or follow-ups, even though the plan was that they were going to release a new episode every 6 months. Well, obviously that fell through, and the other big episodic content thing at the time was Half-Life episodes. And that didn't go very well either. It seemed like episodic content on the source engine is just doomed to fail. That said, this did get a pretty decent reception, and it sold decently, but apparently not enough to fund a sequel. And eventually Ritual did get acquired by Mumbo Jumbo, and they now make casual games. So, the question here is this any good? Because it would be a real shame if this was really good and then we didn't actually get any follow-ups to it, or even if it showed promise and we just didn't get any follow-ups to capitalize on that. Well, as far as the presentation goes, it certainly looks like a game on the source engine at the time, which means that some of the textures are fairly low res, but most of them are okay. The modeling is pretty well done for the most part, but the animations can be a bit robotic and stiff sometimes. And the environments are pretty well detailed for the most part. I did notice there is a bit of performance problems, but other than that, they did a pretty good job with the visuals overall. Although, again, it does look like a pretty typical Source game, and it just can't escape the engine issues that brings with it. Sound design is pretty decent too. Voice acting's solid. It's nothing amazing, but it's solid. It works quite well for the most part. Although it is quite annoying that you don't have the wisecracking Colonel Blade as you did in the original SiN. He's completely silent this time around, because apparently that's what modern games do and what Source Engine games do. Silent protagonist. Oh well. Music is solid. It works pretty well for this game, but it's nothing amazing either, and it's certainly not very memorable. I really can't remember a single track from this thing unless I actually go through and play it, and I'm like, oh, well, this is pretty solid music at the time, but it doesn't really stick with me. But overall, they've done a pretty solid job with the audio presentation as well. I'm not a fan of the weapon sounds, though. They are kind of weak. And I really do wish that they would have done something much more beefy and have a lot more punch. But it works okay. And the weapons themselves, despite not having that super punchy sound effect, really do have a different effect when you're actually in the game, so you can let it slide a bit. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and that's certainly a problem because the story is wildly incomplete. After all, it is the first episode of what was supposed to be an episodic game. So they introduce a lot of plot points that don't really seem to go anywhere. Lots of threads are left hanging. It gets pretty ridiculous. And the plot itself is pretty weak. You play as Colonel John Blade. He's the same guy you played in the original game, of course. And after the events of the original SiN, he is still hot on the trail of Alexis Sinclair, the head of SiNtech Industries, and basically trying to stop her from unleashing her mutagen on the world and sending all these mutants everywhere to wreak havoc. Pretty weak plot, actually. And the defining characters are, of course, Blade himself, who is now a mute and is no longer cracking jokes, no longer making quips, which was a pretty big feature of the original game, actually, and lent it a lot of character. But in this particular case, nope, not really. Completely silent, kind of like Gordon Freeman, only it's more annoying, because at least Gordon Freeman was always silent, whereas Blade wasn't. He is accompanied by Jessica Cannon, his sidekick, who does lend some more personality to the game, but she's never really developed all that well, and you don't really get too wildly attached to her. Sinclair herself got most of her defining features from the original game, and they sort of persist here. She is hypersexual, And so a lot of the events going on right now in the gaming world are centering around this kind of issue. But she is portrayed as this strong femme fatale character who is, again, overly sexualized to the point where it gets kind of ridiculous. I can't really take her seriously. And I don't think anybody can really take her all that seriously. So she isn't honestly that threatening of a villain and just comes across as a completely ridiculous, almost cartoony villain. And so none of these characters really grab you and pull you into the game. They tended to rely with Alexis on sex appeal rather than anything else. And it becomes kind of annoying, actually. The original game handled it slightly better because it was more campy, but this one is played fairly straight. And so it just has this really bizarre disconnect between this and the original game. And all that blends together to make the plot and the characters incredibly unappealing. So how's the gameplay? Well, it's kinda like Half-Life 2 in a lot of ways. Only not quite as interesting. You have 3 weapons. You have a magnum, you have a shotgun, and you have an assault rifle. That's pretty much it. And your pistol is your magnum. So you have a very limited selection of weapons. They're not particularly interesting. The pistol itself tends to be a very good option because it basically one-shots anything if you get a headshot. So why not use it? And the shotgun is surprisingly unsatisfying for a weapon that's supposed to send enemies flying. I'm not sure whether it's the animations or the incredibly wimpy sound effect, but even though it does send enemies flying sometimes, it's really not that impressive and doesn't feel all that great. The assault rifle feels rather underdeveloped as well. It just isn't that powerful, and apart from being able to use a sort of scope on it, it's not really that handy. So more often than not, you just find yourself using the shotgun and the pistol most of the time, switching to the assault rifle when it's handy. The levels themselves are very, very linear. There's not a lot of exploration to them, and you will find that there aren't all that many secrets to find. And by that I mean there are none, at least none that I noticed, whereas the original game certainly had them. Of course, the original game was also an old school FPS more than anything else, so that probably helped. This one feels like it's following in the Half-Life episode's footsteps. Very linear, and with a lot of just monster box rooms, effectively. You go in, a bunch of dudes show up, you wipe them out, you move to the next room, you repeat. You might have to flip a switch here and there, but that's kinda it. And the level design is not particularly interesting. You'd think with a sort of sci-fi, cyberpunk kind of setting, they could have done a lot more with it, but they didn't. Now, again, this is the first episode of an episodic game, and the only episode of said episodic game. It's not particularly good to go off of, and unfortunately it's all we've got. It's kind of hard to actually judge this thing, because on the one hand, it is supposed to be judged as a game that is several parts to the whole. Apparently there were supposed to be 9 episodes, and they only released 1. And yet, the only one we have is the first episode. So I have to judge it as just a game in and of itself. And in and of itself, it is supremely mediocre. It's not particularly satisfying. The thing will keep you going for a bit, but it's a pretty short game, and there's really not all that much reason to play it, because again, it just feels so inconclusive. There's nothing there, there's no closure, and it just leaves everything open for what were supposed to be later episodes, only to not have any. That said, if you get it on Steam, it does come with the original SiN, and the original SiN is well worth playing. So, there is that silver lining. But this game in itself, pretty mediocre. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.